us to kind of go back, particularly because one of the agenda items today is to kind of continue that conversation around our current understanding of our must support flags and where they're applied, and how we can kind of start to shift our thinking towards some of the obligation codes that we've been reviewing together, to see whether or not that allows for us to better understand how application on elements like patient and status and code, things that are repeatedly coming up across guides, but that we have must supports on and can't otherwise remove, how a transition might be better managed using obligations potentially, or at least using the phrases and the kind of behaviors that are described in obligations to understand what we really mean when we apply a flag to something like patient. So I've got on one side of my screen, I'll pull up the obligations again. We talked through basically, I think, on the producer side and compared that to our must support definitions previously. And we left off, I think, a pretty active conversation on our receiver side that I'd like to pick up again, and then talk through what that might mean for an application and immunization, which is what we were looking at when we started.
Questions.
Yep.
In terms of the recordings, have we fully moved to the YouTube channel, or are we still, like, where are we posting the recordings?
We fully moved to the YouTube channel for the recordings. Every once in a while, the deck, I will upload it to OwnCloud, but the recording should be on the YouTube channel. The only thing that we've got to do some historical uploads, but everything from, I think, January of 2022 is up.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yep. All right. And that's, I should have it, but we do have a YouTube channel that I can actually post in the chat for folks who aren't aware. I may have to do it at the end. Because I have to sign out of a couple accounts before I can post it. So
yeah, that's okay. Just because I was away in the holidays, I missed some stuff. So
okay, perfect. So what I'm going to do, so that would be, like, I think, the primary portion of our agenda today, because we are talking about testing new FHIR mechanisms, because we've had some really cool things emerge in our tooling in the last couple of weeks. I thought I might also talk a little bit about imposed profiling and start talking about how mechanisms like that, similar to obligations, may make us more leverageable, and maybe a way of, considering modifying our approaches that we previously published on, how FHIR authors can demonstrate alignment and use of the CA baseline. So I want to start that conversation now, but I think we really need to kind of also close out some of our considerations around obligation as well. So I'm thinking like a 80-20 split, if we can do it. So let me pull out obligations. So we've got
FHIR thing. So
sorry,
I said 80-20 is the classic FHIR guideline.
Oh yeah, right. And the impossible thing to actually manage all the time in all things. Yeah. It's an optimist's number. So for the obligation extension, and I'll post it in the chat so you guys can follow along too, because we've been working and looking at it a little bit on the CA baseline perspective, but we are also looking at it in a number of international guides and playing around with its use. So it is important to become familiar with this. So I'm opening it up, and I'm going to open up the value set for obligation codes, because this is what we've been using kind of as the reference point for, what are all the ways that must support's been maybe interpreted in the past, so that we have some of, something that we can try to tie our use of must support against and flesh out, like, what are the boundaries of it really? Because I think this is, even though we've spent a good deal of time talking through how we intended it to be used in various scenarios, there is this kind of boundary that needs exploration when it comes to, like, system behaviors, because really we just talk about things, I think, from the, like, examples scenario, and not so much on the, like, how would someone demonstrate this perspective, which obligations tend to be a little bit more focused around from a structured standpoint. So we talked about can send, will send, use reason last week, and I think, if I'm recalling it, keep me honest, but I think there was, like, a little bit of a debate between whether or not we'd use will send versus use reason in a guide that's like the CA baseline, given that it tends to be more abstract and, you know, having someone or having a system be expected to send data absent reasons for areas that we'd like to have harmonization around sometimes is like that one step that's stricter. And so we talked a little bit about, you know, where does use reason give us more than something like will send, and a little bit about its fit in terms of our philosophy. I think we kind of avoided talking about will present and NUI because they are that much like very clearly a step beyond what is defined typically in an exchange spec. So they focus more on you know, what the application actually does with you know, the element that is being produced, and effectively like how manipulatable it is, which is something that we really haven't touched on in our definitions to date, nor would be typical for a base or a baseline to do. And I think we left off on a conversation about the consumer obligations. So each of these are kind of grouped into like producer, exchanger, consumer, and we can define our own actors. So like, you know, if you wanted to call a consumer a specific type of application, that would be defined as an actor. But the point of this hierarchy is just to describe like, these tend to be things that are enforced or are incurred when you are consuming a piece of information. And so we left off talking about no error. And I think, is Paul on the line? I think one of the conversation points was like, where would this actually come up in how someone would use the baseline? And like, is it meaningful compared to must handle or must process? So I kind of wanted us to continue that conversation. So what I'll do is like, I think for folks who like verbal, we'll do a quick landscape and then we'll talk about what we think would be a good match. So the base, yeah, go
do a
ahead.
summary of where we ended up for those of us who weren't here the last time?
Yeah, so I think we were kind of, I heard when I re-listened to the recording, a split between, I think it was no error and must handle. So I don't think we really determined which we thought was a better fit. Was that how other folks recalled it?
Well, as I read those two definitions, they don't sound like they're that related.
So you mean for a receiver to have to, they aren't hierarchically related.
No, because the receiver says it should accept resources containing valid values without erroring. It doesn't say it needs to do anything with them, right?
Yep.
It just says it should accept them. And then the second one says conformant applications must handle the meaning of the element correctly, which I think we get into a discussion about what that means.
Yep.
But I think that's different from saying you're not going to create an error condition if you receive it.
And so the point you're making is that like we could consider both independently or combined.
Depending upon the condition.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, do folks think that both could be applicable to how we anticipate as a baseline our must reports should be understood? The one piece I'll note on this, so they talk a lot about like, hey, this is kind of a vague rule. They don't necessitate that we define exactly what that means. But one sentence I found to be kind of helpful about this would be like, it marks that this would be problematic. There would be a known safety issue if it was ignored. So that's kind of one of the pieces I narrow in on when I read this.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, even in the RFC 1, ARB was trying to get the FHIR environment to define what handle or process meant. I think it's probably, from a baseline point of view, probably easier to say that if you receive something that's valid, you shouldn't error out. So the no error is an easier bar. There may be things where we want to say must handle, but I think saying that if you get something that's valid, even if it's not pertinent to you, you shouldn't create an error. So I think the no error obligation is a more reasonable bar in a baseline context than the must handle. Because the must handle gets into use cases and application processing and other things I don't know the baseline can address. I don't know. What do other people think?
Sarah Sheridan or Lorraine, can I just ask a dumb question?
Please.
I'm trying to wrap my head around still with regards to this must support and the cardinality. So if it's a 1-1, sorry, if the lower bound is 1, meaning to say you have to have something there, right? And say no, you're not. It's not a must support. Isn't that oxymoron?
So we're talking about receiver responsibilities here, not necessarily the cardinality and the must support. I think those are two different things.
I agree. So I'm just trying to understand how they relate to each other, and if it makes sense to have a must support of no, and at the same time it's 1. The lower bound is 1.
So are you like queuing in on kind of this may ignore the data element if it's received?
No, I'm just looking at, does it make sense to have a cardinality, for example, of 1-1 and a must support of no?
So actually, this was something we talked about 2 sessions ago, which was kind of on the argument you were making, does it make sense to always apply a must support to a 1-to-1? And I think the places where I actually may have it in our ticket, folks felt that just because something is in the base specification, which oftentimes, like when you're seeing this, it's something that we haven't flagged as must support that would be otherwise minimum of 1 in the base. It's not that we would be making this constraint, but not applying a must support to it. But that there are things that will come through that are expected to be supplied for, like a lot of times it's like status around events, that things are 1-to-1 for, but that not every use case ends up requiring those or doing something meaningful with them or further processing in some way.
So why not just put the lower bound to 0 if it's not really a must support?
Because we can't relax something that's already mandatory of 1 in the base spec.
So in this case, that might be where the receiver responsibility is no error, because it's required in the base spec. You need to send it, and you're asking the receiver not to error if they get it, even if they don't care about it. Right? So we're trying to get finer grained than what the old must support pieces were, I think. Does that make sense? I missed who the speaker was. I'm sorry, who was bringing that up.
It's Finny, Lorraine.
Okay, thank you.
So if it's not a must support, then why make it a 1? Why not change the base to 0?
We can't. If it's in the base spec, it's already a 1.
I think the only places that may happen where something has been that we actually make a change on are sometimes around things like slicing. So I've seen it with our coding and I've seen it with our identifiers, but that's about the only place that we'd ever, I think, and please, I challenge everyone, go out, read this back, see if this isn't the case. But I think thematically, that's the only place we don't apply a must support on a place that we change a cardinality to min of 1.
Yeah, because so the most in the base spec, there's very few min of ones. Status is one of them.
Yeah.
There's some places where in our slicing we say, you shall have a PHN, for instance.
Or you shall
Under
supply
identifier.
a value and a system if you're going to tell me of an identifier of type PHN.
Correct.
Yeah.
So there's some of those kinds of things.
So
But
effectively, a
So I
must
take
support is
Finney's
just a
point that-
workaround against the cardinality. Is that what we're trying to say here?
I think,
I don't
go ahead,
I don't
Lorraine.
think we're talking about a workaround. I think we're talking about where we previously defined must support. How do we use the newer mechanisms to be more explicit and specific about what we mean when we say must support? Is that not what we're talking about?
Yep.
Yeah, so I'm actually just backtracking a little bit, Laura, in terms of just trying to wrap around my head in terms of a one, the minimum of one, but you're not obliged to support it. So to me, it doesn't make sense. Or a must support of yes, but your lower bound is 0. So to me, it does not make sense.
Well, a must support of yes with a lower bound of 0 is actually makes lots of sense. It says if you get it, you need to know what to do with it, but it doesn't say you have to get it. I take your point on the lower bound of 1, but the question is, partly because the base spec leaves it up to implementation guides to define what must support means. It may very well be that what we really mean is that if you get it, you shouldn't error. Or we may mean if you get it, you need to understand it, know what to do with it.
It's just a weird place. So like a base or a baseline spec is probably one of the only specs that incurs this line of questioning, because most of the time, like Lorraine said, if you have something that's mandatory of 1, you will see a must support flag on something that's more like implementation specific. And so very few guides would ever kind of think, well, it just means don't error out. It means do something with it. Because most of the time when a guide uses a must support, when it's not a base, there is much more detail surrounding it. And so our challenge is, if these become some of the only places where a must support is left, what is meaningful that we can say for our perspective as a base aligns to our expectation of what we want to happen beyond just make sure your instances have this if they're valid in FHIR. And I think we have to make that determination. Like, do we have to make that statement if this is the only statement we can make?
Yeah. So for instance, in B2, in the receiver responsibilities, one of the requirements is that if you receive something that's new when you don't know about, because it's a later version, that you don't reject all the other material, which is sort of like the no error thing here.
That's sorry. Just a question about that no error thing, but isn't that just like the standard like expectation of like with the FHIR, like that you wouldn't error out if you received a value in there if it's in alignment with the
FHIR's the current FHIR material here that Sheridan is showing is trying to give us a way to be more specific in how we express that. But yes, I think you're right. That's sort of the current expected behavior.
Rules of the road.
Yeah, so I just don't know like what what significance in the no error one is, since it's like the rule of the road already.
Well, there's also the must understand on extensions and a couple other things, but right.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a misnomer, this must support in my head. It should be expectation.
That's sort of why we're trying, the FHIR is proposing going to receiver and sender obligations and being more specific, because the must support is problematic right now.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to clarify, make sure that I'm not missing anything.
Yeah, because you're right about that statement, that the must support is kind of wonky, and particularly in the context of shared instead of a baseline, which is one of the reasons why most of the baselines have not defined must support on any of their fields, because they don't have the use case context to know what people are using.
Or they're intentionally trying to like to avoid applying like downstream business rules where their intent is not to enforce certain system design or behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe that's a good question. Does anyone think, I'll start with, do we think we have an argument that we shouldn't have a consumer obligation if we were talking about, you know, to put it to realism, a consumer obligation for something like status, based on where we see philosophically our intent is for these types of constraints? Or the reverse, would anyone make the argument that we absolutely should have some type of obligation for a consumer for an element like status? As a
No,
baseline?
this is like a modifier element. So if the status is entered in error, you have to be able to understand that and consume it.
So is that an argument for having something, some extra expectation from a baseline perspective?
So would that be like must handle then? Like the must support on status there? The meaning for that one would be like the must handle.
So incurs potential issue with safety, but vaguely around don't ignore it.
I would have
Yeah, I don't-
expected that to be a modifier element. Personally, I'm surprised it's not.
I don't understand the difference between must handle and must process, actually.
Actually, I think it is. Oh, so Rita, it is. I just was showing the diff. And you were asking about must handle and must process, Lorraine. So with must handle, so we looked at this a little bit in IPA this week. And I think we saw the difference as, you know, must handle implies like you're not going to error. There is some expectation for something in your system will incorporate, will kind of understand the meaning of this information. Whereas must process, you might have an implementation guide that specifically says, and this is what you're supposed to do. So rather than leaving it up to the implementer to say, I do something, this is more like, I'm going to tell you what you're supposed to do with it. Is that how others read it?
I didn't think it said that, but I could. Even reading the descriptions, I don't see a difference between handling and processing. But that may be my mental blockage.
The difference I see is that must handle says you have to do something with, but doesn't specify what. Whereas must process is actually going to say you must do this when you get this message.
Well, the thing is that must process doesn't say what you do. It just says you have to do something.
No, but it says the IG has to specify what's supposed to be done.
So an example might be my IG would say, this has to be, you know, stored against an existing user in the system. No,
Okay.
I
Yeah,
would never say
okay,
that, but that would be a process.
Sure.
Recommendation.
And if that's true, must process is probably out of scope for the baseline.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what I was just going to say. It doesn't seem like something we should be pushing into baseline.
Yeah, it can be really powerful for folks that want to use this for like direct implementation guides, but I would be worried about what these rules would be. But maybe, I mean, are there folks that think that there is some type of rule that we could specify that would be safe at a baseline level?
it would be specific for each element, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Because it's applied at the element level.
So I don't think so.
So are we feeling more confident about our interpretation of how we've applied must support and how we want to, more aligning towards must handle? Or are there some of us that are still considering no error?
I'm leaning towards no error myself. Interested to hear others' feedback.
I can see for situations like the chosen thing of status, you know, when we do an immunization, it comes through in the there is no status to it. It's just a recorded the event. So when you start trying to put stuff like that onto you must handle, there's going to be no value, or even
Well,
with no error.
Status has to be there because it's status of the record, not status of the event. Right?
Yep.
So what comes in the status is basically this is the valid record. It's not been errored record or deleted record, etc. It's an active record. So you're going to get, that's one of the reasons status is 1-to-1, is because the status field is not the business status, it's the record status in most respects.
I think going with that assumption, then we really need to make sure that everywhere we're using status, that we put that explanation in, that it's not the status of the event being recorded, but it's the status of the record of the event.
I think there are some resources where it depends.
Well, actually, and we've been trying to clean that up in terms of, HL7 International, in terms of our statuses, because there were some resources where those two things were conflated.
Yeah, because I actually think immunization might be.
I mean, even if you just look at that immunization, what
Of
does
the
a
event.
record status of not done mean?
I think it's for the event for sure. For this.
Yeah, I
this
think
thing.
it's one of the immunization may be one of those records where we've conflated the two, because entered in error isn't a status of the event. It's the status of the record, right? So we've got both in there.
It's a required binding too, so it can only be like 3 of those codes. That completed, entered an error, and not done.
And so do we think that like things like status should follow like a different rule for being no error versus must handle versus other things like vaccine code, which is also 1-to-1 in the base spec?
Potentially.
Which way would it go? Would this be a looser expectation or would this be a looser expectation? If that was theoretically what we chose.
I think it's an element by element of business context decision. In this case, my guess is, and the immunization people can correct me, is that the status can only be three values, and so it's much more constrained. Vaccine code is something where, yeah, we want it almost all the time. Sometimes, particularly on historical records, we're going to get just text in that code, in that codable concept. So exactly what we say about it might be slightly different than something like status, which is a code and it can only be 3 values.
And it will error out by a different set of rules if it isn't one of those values.
Yeah, so the SMEs in the space, I think, would say exactly how we'd want to address those, but they're different contexts.
So does it make sense to try to do this with vaccine code and then come back to status? Because it's a different, like we talked about a little bit of, I think this one is actually one of the harder ones because there is like these additional things at play, like you can't use DAR and you have to supply something from this required value set. And so in some ways it's kind of like, it might be a bit of a.
I think that one might be, from my perspective, that one might be more clear cut, like, because I think someone earlier said that if you had entered an error, you better do something about it.
Yeah.
So it's like, seems to me that it's a 1-to-1, so it's going to be sent. So when you're saying must support what are you meaning by that? And what you're really meaning is that you're going to do something with it.
Problem is, with our messages, there is no status for this things because it's just recorded of stuff that's done. It's always going to be stuff that's done. So putting that mandatory response of any sort in means we're putting overhead on an element that's never going to change. It's always going to have a constant fixed value.
You think it'll always be completed
Yeah.
and never the other two values?
Well,
Never.
in
Our
which
work,
case you set it to a fixed value that's a default, and you just keep moving.
right? But if you start putting in there, you say must process or something like this, and put some rules behind that, then we have a problem because we're not going to process it because it's never going to change.
Right. I guess like for the receiver, it being a must handle, like the description says vague, so it would be up to I guess the IG guide to like kind of specify how to handle it. So people using the baseline spec, or using the baseline profile would need to look at that and think, oh, I got to do something with this.
Well, which is why I was leaning to we shouldn't err, right? And going further and saying you have to handle or process it for the baseline for a consumer might be a bridge too far from what I'm hearing. I don't know. I'm just trying to listen to what I'm hearing.
And it may only be that must handle doesn't work in a handful of use cases on status, right? We could say, okay, well, in places where we have a really definitive, this would incur a burden on like an existing system and existing use case today. We could say, okay, let's say for immunization, that's the case, but for, allergy or for encounter, it isn't. Like there's nothing that we get to decide how we would consider our expectation for these.
Yeah, but I would think hard about moving up the expectation in the individual case just to make sure it makes sense. So I agree it's something we need to decide on a case by case basis, but I think we need to have a reason to make the expectation more stringent than just not erroring out.
I think status is that case, right? Like, I mean, it's one of, I know like
I just heard from the immunization guys that in their case it's not.
If the context of a site would be that you'd only ever use one status, but I'm more honing in on kind of this piece, which is like, and maybe it's not immunization status, maybe it's something else, but if status is going to impact a patient safety issue, and that's how we've been using it, I think that's the areas we have to, and maybe it's not, like I said, it's maybe if we have a case against immunization, maybe it's not applied there, but.
Well, I mean, and we're going to have to look at each resource because some of them we've actually taken action to differentiate between the business statuses and the record statuses. So we may have different responses based on what kind of status is in the resource. So I don't think we can make a rule. I think we have to look at the case.
Well, do you think it is, so for status, that's true, but does anyone think you could make a rule around, because code is something that often comes up across a number of our resources, condition, vaccine, procedure, encounter, and not all of the time it's min of one in the base spec, but in a lot of them they are. Do you think similarly this has to be assessed on an element by element basis, and how would we assess it against vaccine code?
Could I ask one question about the vaccine code? The must support flag on here, this doesn't mean that users of this profile are bound to use like the CVC.
Correct.
Okay, good. Yeah.
No, so the way that this is, so these slices, basically with that, what's here on vaccine code, it says you got a must support on vaccine code. It's minimum 1 in the base spec. it's been sliced to demonstrate, okay, if you're supplying a coating, here are 2 patterns of coatings that we've socialized here in Canada, but it's open, it's open, meaning we're not saying you have to use any of these slices. Vaccine code is one of the weird places where I think coding has remained that probably should be updated based on our experiences with patient summary implementations, relying really heavily on text in some places. But anyway, that's an aside. So with
it's a preferred binding, which just means we're recommending it, doesn't mean you have to use it.
So do we think just the application on this concept of supplying a text or coded value to describe the vaccine that was administered would be something that when we see a must support there, we see it as more like, well, the baseline should be saying no error versus the baseline should be encouraging no, must handle. Does it meet any of these criteria around patient safety or?
So when you say encouraging, that's where, because there's encouraging and there's requiring. And those are 2 different things.
Well, so I would say requiring, but the baseline has no ability to enforce. So there's no testing program that makes sure that our obligations that might be applied in the future.
If we specify an obligation in the baseline, we're saying that we expect that conformance systems will comply with that obligation.
Yep.
Whether we can enforce it computably or not, that's what we're saying. And so we need to mean that when we say that.
Vinny, I saw you put your hand up to that.
Sorry, not to this particular one, but it's a general question. So finish off, please.
So knowing that, so going back to Lorraine's comment, which is when we say must handle, we mean must handle. When we say no error, we mean no error, regardless of the surrounding information. Do we think the vaccine code, when we have said must support to date, aligns more to must handle or to no error? I think, Lorraine, you've made a case for no error. Would anyone make the case for must handle?
So in this particular context, it might be something must handle or must process must be appropriate. But in the general, I don't think the baseline should be saying must handle.
Would anyone argue against that? I saw Dash and Rita go off mute.
I was just going to say no.
Rita?
But, oh, sorry.
Okay, go ahead, Adesh.
Yeah, no, just back to that other point I made, like the no error, I just don't know if it's significant enough because everything is basically no error.
So Adesh, you would make the case to not have a consumer obligation on vaccine code then?
I just don't know, like the must support flag was there and you put this no error flag there, but I just don't know what difference it actually makes because they wouldn't error out anyway, even if the must support flag wasn't there.
I think in these cases, that's the truth. The other thing I just want to point out is like, there is some additional pieces that may come into play around data absent reason. Meaning like if you were to, I think I interpret this to mean like, if this was a one-to-one element that allowed for data absent reason or no flavor. Let's see, this obligation also applies to elements that contain. Should either of these be allowed on the consumer obligations? So, maybe this just, is this only applicable to DAR or is this applicable to allow for DAR not to be errored? maybe we'll come back to it. But anyway, it seems fringe compared to like, I think the argument you're making, Adesh, which is like generically, it doesn't provide a lot of weight.
Well, yeah, and producer obligations are one thing, sender obligations are one thing, but in the baseline, in terms of consumer obligations, I'm reluctant to get too stringent on consumers, what they're doing with the information.
So
I don't know what the, I mean, so what the feelings of others are. And so there might be some places where we should be stringent. So if you're in an immunization application, maybe you really should handle at least the original text of a vaccine code at a minimum, for instance. But because we may not have codes for all of the historical vaccine records, for example. But when we're talking about consumer applications from the baseline, I think we just really don't know what consumers are going to try to do.
So Lorraine, would you make the case then for just not having it on the consumer end? Would anyone? Go ahead.
To answer that, I would say, in general, I would make the case for not having obligations on the consumer end, unless there's something specific.
Yeah.
In that context, like I just said about vaccines, saying, well, you got to have at least the original text to say what the vaccine was, you know.
And that would be specific for the baseline, yeah. Because I guess my even was shorthand for we shouldn't have it in the baseline because it's really powerful otherwise. But
yeah, now in other IGs, having being really clear about what the consumer obligations are, yeah, I'm all for that. But in the baseline, we really don't have any idea what consumers we're dealing with.
Although in something, in a case like the status, where it could be completed, entered in error, not done. If somebody sends that, you don't have to send that element if you don't want, although you do because it's 1-to-1. But if somebody sends that element, you have to be able to understand it and apply it. You have to be able to process it. The consumer has to be able to process it. It's a modifier element. You can't ignore it.
Mm-hmm. So that covers us on status. Is vaccine code a modifier?
It's a modifier, yeah.
Okay.
But then, if you go further down, there's another modifier element, is subpotent, so that the dose potency is not strong enough. That's a modifier element as well. If someone sends it, the consumer should be able to process that, but you don't have to send it.
So, okay, so in places where we do have an is modifier, which is the icon here.
Yeah. So in that example, the subpotent, if you've got a app that's all it's doing is showing historical records, does it need to understand that?
If it's there, then it does, yes. If somebody sends that, then yes, you have to understand it. I think any modifier elements, if somebody sends it to you, you're obligated to understand it.
So I think actually I'm aware, I think I paused Finney's question. We kind of have two questions going here, which is if and when we shift to obligations, how do we incorporate modifiers? And then there's a secondary question, which is like, should we just apply producer obligations that I'd like us to think on? Because I haven't heard a lot of arguments for consumers, it doesn't sound like most people are thinking must handle is going to be relevant, but I think we should probably think about it as a rule. So when we get closer to actually transitioning, if folks want to do that, let's reopen that conversation of should we leave consumers on the table. But Finney, I know about 5 minutes ago you had a specific question that wasn't related to the must handle question.
Yeah, apologies being late in the party. But anyhow, how do we envision this to be specified? Are we capturing another data element to support this value set obligation, or?
So how it actually gets, and big plug right now for some of the cool stuff we've been working on. So it is specified as an extension on our profiles, which is why it's a really important thing for profile authors to start familiarizing with themselves. So I have just a public repo where we've got, a couple examples of what does an obligation look like? What's the actor definition? It's just, if you wanted to start working with it and playing with it, you could see how it's applied. And effectively, you can apply it, you know, at your structure definition level or within the elements themselves. So if you're interested in kind of like what it actually ends up looking like, the repo is in the chat. And as of this week, they are rendering in IG Publisher, which we're really excited about. So it's very early stages, but it will give us something to react to if we want to start thinking about how we might apply these in our own profiles.
Okay, thank you. So individually, so as necessary, it will be applied to the individual data elements, attributes.
Yep.
For the resources, right? Okay. So this is also an initiative that's happening in the international level.
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
Both with obviously with HL7 trying to promote its use as you know, a replacement, an alternative to must support and the challenges that must support has experienced over the years. And there's a lot of momentum happening with the national bases and national cores to try to use this, because cores and bases are specifically impacted by the challenges of must supports, because a lot of times we want to have folks leveraging our content that having an unclear expectation makes it oftentimes very difficult to do.
So eventually must support will go away. Is that the idea?
Yeah. So the way that it's posed, I think in R5 and R6 is that right now you're allowed to supply both. There are some rules around how to interpret an obligation in combination with a must support. The idea would be to provide a bridge for folks who have profiles that may take a while and have additional things that they want to make sure they're communicating in must support flags, but that a lot of the base and core community is being recommended to use in green.
Did obligation make it into R5?
I think it did, or at least it's in the must support. It's in the must support profiling section where it may have just linked out to like the replacement page.
Yeah, because I remember it being proposed, but I wasn't sure if it made it into the spec.
So let's take a look.
I'll have to go look and see.
Yeah, because there's a couple different places. One would be as an extension that made its way into the spec.
But it
was
is
isolated in.
It's definitely the direction that HL7 International is going.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's marked experimental.
Yeah, and I think the way they dealt with it is they took it into the extensions IG.
Yeah.
So that they could
when they
be
separated
cross-version.
extensions from the core.
Yeah.
So it's not in the core spec yet, but it's definitely the direction they're going.
Yeah, and actually let me pull up. There's some good language that I saw that, because we've been talking about what happens if you have this in combination with must support, particularly when you look at derivations over time. And I thought there was some good guidance I'm just pulling out now.
Yeah. And once you do that, I want to put a question on the table that I don't think we can answer today. But
here is obligations in the build, which kind of talks about like, how do you interpret the combination of both versus just the presentation of one? So Lorraine, and I'm tossing my 80/20 out the window. I think we'll talk about impose another day. You said you have another question that we think we should noodle on.
Well, I think it should be in our queue. I don't think we can answer it now. We're talking about stuff that's R5 and R6 and extensions. Now, extensions have been separated from the core, and you can always sort of use an extension no matter what version it's in. But we've said we're R4 based. And we're now talking about, I think appropriately, bringing stuff that's extensions that's post R4. So we might want to look at our assertion of FHIR versions and how we deal with extensions, and you know what is what are candidate pieces of material to deal with in our profiles, because we've said we're R4 only.
We did, and it's kind of a weird gray space because it's like it's not really backported per se, but a lot of these extensions, so they were separated out so that they could become applicable across versions. And the nuance here is that IG Publisher is, one of the tools that many of our others use, is saying we've built in the work to allow any version iGuide or profile, any version of R4, R5, R4B to utilize these, but we'll also need our other tools like Trifolia and like Forge and our projects like Simplifier to also support these things.
Well, that's true for pretty much all of the extensions, and it's going to hit us with the gender harmony extensions as well, and maybe other extensions. So my point is just that we may actually want an explicit position on this.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think we can answer that now, but that's something we probably should put in our queue.
So when we're thinking about our queue, do folks think now would be at least the right time to, maybe knowing that an obligation can be applied, even if we weren't ready to remove a must support, to start going through the work of trialing out, adding in these obligations where we've talked about them being necessary? Or do we want to talk more like to the point that Lorraine is making at our next profiling call, which is, will we make a statement about incorporation of extensions that are available to us, but that may not have been introduced in the version of FHIR that we use? What would be folks' preferences for kind of, I think it's 2 weeks from now is our next profiling call. Does anyone see any risk, or like, I'm just trying to think, like, because I am very interested in this space, I don't want to push us faster than we're ready to go with trialing out obligations. Would there be any reason we wouldn't try to at least start like noting and going through the profiles and saying, well, maybe we could remove a must support, or maybe we keep it and we apply this obligation so we have more clarity to our users about what that means?
I personally don't see any risk. It's just that we've said we're not doing that before when we talked about the other kinds of extensions. So I just wanted to make sure we were consistent in what our policies were.
Also, if you look at the reference that you sent under obligations, it says if an element is labeled as must support, the element can specify obligations associated with its use, providing one or more obligations using the obligation. It infers that it's only must support elements that can specify obligations. The way I'm reading it.
Oh, let me see the R4 or the R5 language. That's a good point. It's, I don't anticipate that that's how it's supposed to be interpreted, but it may be a wording.
No, from what I've read so far, that wasn't the intent, but that may not be how it's specified right now.
Let's see what R5 says.
And of course, this is still all in flux. Which is, I think, the only risk I see is that some of the stuff may change as we're working with it. Benefit of that is if we find things or feedback we want to make it work better, now's the opportunity to, excuse me, suggest change. So there's risk and benefit to both of those.
So I think on the point of reasons we have like a consistent practice around extensions, when I thought about like when we were talking about the gender harmony ones and when to include them, I don't think we actually said we would exclude them on the basis that they weren't in R4. I think what we documented was that we would come back to them when the changes had been resolved from the last ballot, which might mean that in thinking about obligations, we also want to think about some of these other extensions now, if the changes.
Yeah, well, I think when we made those statements about sticking with R4, that was before we HL7 International divided extensions from the core. Right, so now that extensions are sort of in a separate space.
Yeah.
That's just making sure we're clear is my point.
Got it.
Right.
So maybe do we want to start with that statement, next profiling call, and then go into obligations? I think that was like the case Lloyd was making, is like, even if you don't write the obligations right away, just like going through the process of like noting them and saying, this is what I would apply, will be helpful to people.
Yeah, that's what I was actually, so we could have both worlds. We don't apply yet, but we analyze so that we can raise issues if as we go through them. Because if we start applying now, it's still in flux, then,
Yep.
you know, we run the risk of rework.
So let's start then.
But I agree, analyzing and knowing what we would say is
Yeah.
useful.
Yeah. And so maybe let's start with like the first couple, maybe like 10, 15 minutes talking about like, let's just record a decision that we are going to be, here's our process to respond to the fact that extensions are now housed elsewhere. And then moving into, okay, let's just document. We talked a lot about immunization. We could get through the remainder of what will be, I think, one other must support flag and immunization. And that's a good starting point. All right. Well, I think that's it for today. Rita, oh shoot, I just stopped sharing. Was there, you had a hand up?
No, I mentioned it. I've already said it. It was about
Okay.
the obligations
Okay.
when you're applying to must support.
All right, perfect. Okay, so I'll stop the recording. We'll make it available later tonight on our YouTube channel, and I will see